My name is George Tobit. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Edge Hill. Delighted to welcome you all here this evening for the latest in our series of inaugural lectures from Vinnie Lander. Vinnie joined us last year, May of last year, from University of Chichester, where she had been head of primary education. As well as that role, for 6 years, from 2004 to 2010, she was seconded as Deputy Director of the Multiverse project, which was funded by the TDA. And the TDA funded Multiverse as a professional resource network on achievement and diversity, which ties in with Vinnie's research interests, which she will be speaking to us about this evening. She has worked prior to that in schools as a science teacher, biology teacher, up to A-level, and worked at Chichester for a number of years prior to becoming head of primary education. She's undertaken research in the area of student teachers developing subject knowledge in science and written support materials for Sci Centre. She's also been an Ofsted inspector for primary schools and for initial teacher training. She has been the director of the special interest group in ethnicity, race and education for BIRA, and in that regard has won an award for the Meeting of Minds Award for Emerging Researchers in 2011. She's one of the lead authors for the Respecting Children project under the auspices of BIRA, which launches its Alternative Manifesto for Children next Tuesday, the 10th of March, in London. And last year, as I expect most of you are aware, she was awarded a National Teaching Fellowship from the Higher Education Academy. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Vinnie this evening to speak about her research, after which Lynette Turner, the PVC for Education, will deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, Vinnie.
Thank you very much, George. Colleagues, friends and family and visitors to Edge Hill University, thank you for coming today to this lecture. I'd also like to thank Edge Hill University and the Faculty of Education for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you tonight. It is indeed a privilege. Those of you in the audience who know me well will know that at times I'm not a person who always follows convention. So why break a habit of a lifetime tonight? I would beg your indulgence for a moment to break with convention before I move on to the substantive content of my lecture. Now, some of you will know that sadly my mother passed away suddenly in August last year. I know if she was alive today, she would have been here today to listen to this lecture. So I'd like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of my mother, who died in August. Some of what you hear is a result of the strength she showed throughout her lifetime and throughout my upbringing as well. In this inaugural lecture, I hope to take you on a narrative journey which encapsulates and interweaves my own journey with that of children, teachers and teacher educators. This journey, covering the last 40 years, will be set against the background of the political and policy shifts that have shaped the debates on immigration, the education of immigrant children, multicultural education, and teacher education. And through the lecture, I will draw on three concepts which have recurred through the time that I've engaged in race, ethnicity, and education. The first of these is the presence of absence, and my thanks to the American academic Michael Apple for conceiving of this idea. The second is the notion of the space invader. And here I don't mean the game, but I mean the space invader versus the somatic norm, as defined by the Sikh academic Nirmal Purwa. The third concept is the invisibility and hypervisibility concept. It's been used for many long years in the field of race and ethnicity and drawn on by many race scholars, but particularly those working in the field of critical race theory. The journey starts with two little girls, one aged 6 and the other 3, who left their country of birth to migrate to a new country with their parents. Factors such as political instability, declining economy, a military uprising, and simply wanting a better life led to this migration. Now imagine those two little girls, aged 9 and 6, standing holding hands at the edge of a pavement, ready to cross the road to go on an errand for their mother to buy bread. As they looked left and they looked right, and you know, they were members of the Tufty Club. Now, some of you might be too young to actually pick that nuance up, but as members of the Tufty Club, they knew the rules about crossing the road. They looked left and they looked right. And in that moment, something happened that influenced the life of one of those little girls. Just a little bit further down was a woman holding the hand of her little daughter. The two little girls, aged 9 and 6, looked left and they looked right. And as they did so, their gaze caught that of the woman just standing a little bit down the road. Two little girls, aged 9 and 6, caught the gaze of this woman holding the hand of her daughter. This woman, as she actually saw those two little girls, with all the volume she could muster, venomously shouted, "I hope you two packies get run over." Two little girls, aged 9 and 6. What did we do? We did nothing. Numb with shock and powerless, my sister and I crossed the road, feeling hurt, bought the bread, and quietly walked home. Those words rang in my head over and over again as they did then and as they've resonated over the years. As a child, those words gave rise to many questions. Why should someone who was a mother hurl such abuse at children? What had we done that was so wrong? Were we so aberrant that she would wish a fate such as death on us? It is this early experience of racism that has stayed with me and triggered me to ask further questions throughout my education and beyond. Questions such as, why does racism exist? Why are people racist? How can we stop racism? And why haven't we eradicated it yet? Why don't we seem to learn the lessons of history? In that instance, as those words of hate were heard, in that instance, my sister and I were the wrong people in the wrong place. There we were, hypervisible and not belonging. In order to understand the context of my research, I need to briefly trace the policy shifts that have shaped education in response to the changing multicultural nature of our society. This is a whistle-stop tour and by no means comprehensive, and in the audience I know there are some real scholars of multiculturalism. As schools became more ethnically diverse, education policy was inevitably influenced by the political approaches of the time. The policy shifts and responses have moved from assimilation to integration to multiculturalism to citizenship and now Britishness. The overriding approach to the presence of minority ethnic pupils in schools in the 1950s and 1960s was one of assimilation into the majority culture. Assimilation is a one-way process which requires the incomer to abandon, at least in public, the markers of their ethnic and cultural identity. As a young girl, arriving in Britain, I spoke English, having been educated at an English medium school. But even then, the forces of assimilation infiltrated our home. ਹੁਣ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਥੋੜੀ ਟੁੱਟੀ ਜੀ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਦਾ ਕਸੂਰ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤਾਂ ਬੱਚੀ ਸੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਮੈਂ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਆਈ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਪਿਤਾ ਜੀ ਹਰ ਰੋਜ਼ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਬੋਲੋ, ਚੰਗੇ ਮਾਰਕਸ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਇਓ, ਫਿਰ ਚੰਗੀ ਕਮਾਈ ਮਿਲੇਗੀ। ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹੀ ਹੋਇਆ। ਚੰਗੇ ਮਾਰਕਸ ਮਿਲੇ ਪਰ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਬੋਲਣੀ ਭੁੱਲ ਗਈ। ਤਾਂ ਹੀ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਟੁੱਟੀ ਜੀ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ। ਹੁਣ ਮੇਰੇ ਪਿਤਾ ਜੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਸੈਮੀਲਿੰਗੁਅਲ ਆ। ਇਹ ਮੇਰੀ ਬੋਲੀ ਦੀ ਕਹਾਣੀ ਹੈ। Okay, so what did I say? Would anyone like to guess? Okay, I'll tell you. For those of you who speak Punjabi, you'll know what I said. But those of you who didn't, I'll let you into what I said now. In recognition that his daughters had to do well in the education system, my father used to insist that we spoke English at home in order to get good results and good employment. Okay, right, I know what you're thinking. Yes, it kind of paid off, didn't it? But you know, it came at a cost. Whilst my level of spoken Punjabi is adequate, I cannot write in my mother tongue and I can't really read Punjabi. Well, only really books like Spot the Dog. So the assimilationist agenda served to disinherit me from developing full linguistic proficiency in my mother tongue and becoming truly bilingual in English and Punjabi. Everyone's cultural, religious and linguistic heritage are important dimensions of identity. Furthermore, assimilation could never have erased the markers of identity, particularly so when an environment of everyday overt racism prevailed and served to show that you were other or alien. The demeaning and dehumanising effects of racism underscored the need to value and retain the markers of your cultural, ethnic and linguistic heritage, come what may. Assimilation gave way to integration, which was considered to be a two-way process which recognised that majority and minority needed to adapt to one another in order to work towards creating a common cultural identity. In 1966, a now famous speech by the Home Secretary of the time, Roy Jenkins, described integration as not as a flattening process of uniformity, but as cultural diversity coupled with equal opportunity in an atmosphere of mutual tolerance. It was always thought that education, schools and teachers had a role to play in forging a shared identity, promoting equal opportunities and developing mutual tolerance. In the Plowden report in 1966, there was recognition that teachers had not been trained to teach immigrant children and that the next steps were to improve pre-service and in-service teacher training on the background of immigrant children. The late 1970s and 1980s saw the introduction of multiculturalism and multicultural education, as well as the development of anti-racist education. Multiculturalism was seen to constitute the belief that all citizens were equal and they all had a right to keep their identity. It promoted racial harmony and the belief that cultural diversity was an accepted part of a pluralistic society. The key tenets of multiculturalism were really equality and tolerance. In schools, the predominant policy of multicultural education prevailed in the 1980s, labouring under the misapprehension that teaching about other cultures would promote that tolerance and that understanding. But multicultural education, at its very worst, became, as Barry Troyner referred to it, as the 3 S's: saris, steel bands and samosas. And you know, it's left its legacy in some schools today where the recognition of Britain as a multicultural society permeates no deeper than foods and festivals covering Diwali and Chinese New Year, yet failing to integrate cultural perspectives within other aspects of the curriculum, say for example science or history. Multicultural education was seen in one dimension, namely that of embracing different incomer cultural traditions within the curriculum. it didn't trouble or deal with racism or rooted structural inequalities. Opponents of multicultural education at the time noted that it did not address that overt or institutional racism evident in society, and anti-racist education was opposed to the soft, tokenistic approach of multicultural education. They felt that the key issue was to tackle racism in society and in schools. Sally Tomlinson, a well-known academic, noted how there was a battle for the school curriculum between national monocultural educational values and multicultural education. I don't think much has changed today. In 2013, it took outrage and indignation voiced by educationalists at the lack of representation of black and minority achievements within the draft national curriculum to really instigate some subsequent changes. The national curriculum is seen by politicians as encompassing the cultural canon, and of course Shakespeare, Dickens and others, the lineage of kings and queens, as well as the achievement of great men and women that have shaped history, the arts, the sciences. They've contributed to the pursuit and development of knowledge, and of course this should feature within that canon. I would argue that it should include the endeavour of black and minority ethnic men and women as well, who've contributed to the pursuit of knowledge. In a developed, what I call a grown-up multicultural society, we cannot continue to maintain the absence of presence, namely to leave out the contribution of black and minority ethnic people from our national curriculum, which is taught within diverse classrooms in state schools. If our children are to recognise that they have a stake in our society, they need to see that diversity within society and their classrooms reflected in their curriculum too. I did O-level history, and I was always perplexed, and still am, I have to say, as to why I was 21 before I really knew and realised that Indian soldiers had fought and died in the 2 world wars. Why was it they didn't feature in my history books? The election of the Thatcher government extinguished the flames of multicultural and anti-racist education. The harnessing of the media to vilify multicultural and anti-racist education has been very well documented and commented on by colleagues such as Professor Chris Game. Throughout most of the 1990s, issues related to ethnicity, race and racism within education were marginalised. Teachers didn't tread into that territory for fear of being identified or labelled as loony lefties. The lack of any supporting policies and the climate of derision really halted any further developments of anti-racist multicultural education. However, a very important yet sad event affected the course of race relations and legislation for a short period of time. It affected the accountability of schools and the inspection of schools with respect to race equality. And here I'm talking about the appalling murder of Stephen Lawrence by racist thugs in April 1993. Not only did that result in the loss of the life of another black youngster, but the quest of the Lawrence family to gain justice for Stephen right the way through from 1993 to 2012 led in 1999 to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry chaired by Lord Macpherson. And of course, as we know, in 2012, 2 of Stephen Lawrence's killers, Norris and Dobson, were convicted of his murder. The outcomes of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry changed the course of race equality for a while. The report identified and defined institutional racism. That wasn't a new concept to people working in the field of race equality. It made 67 recommendations, most of them related to the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, but there were some for education. Those marked in green were enacted and those in red were not. And I would contend that we still haven't amended the national curriculum sufficiently to value cultural diversity, prevent racism, or reflect a diverse society. I would contend that the presence of absence continues. Let's look at displays in classrooms. Let's look at books and curriculum materials. Let's look at university websites. Who's represented and who is omitted? Are the contributions of all people equally represented? The Race Relations Act at the time was amended in 2000, and the 2000 Race Relations Amendment Act placed a proactive duty on public bodies, including schools, to eliminate unlawful racial discrimination, promote equality of opportunity and good relations between people from different racial groups. And as Professor Dave Gilbourne wrote later, the Race Relations Amendment Act was the most radical equalities legislation in the world because of that proactive duty. But this focus on race equality in our schools and within teacher education was short-lived. The responses of schools to meet their duty largely focused on the monitoring of racist incidents as the law required. The battle for schools to take seriously racist bullying brought about as a consequence of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry resulted in the duty placed on schools to record, monitor and report racist incidents. However, that duty was actually swiftly removed by the coalition government in 2012. So now we move on to the concepts that we have today: citizenship and Britishness. The events of 7/11 and the 7/7 bombings led to a fresh examination of the other in society. Debates about identity and belonging to Britain came to the fore, with David Cameron declaring in his 2011 speech in Munich that state multiculturalism had failed. So we now return to this notion of Britishness, and it's not a new notion. It was debated in the 1980s and in the 1990s. It was rejected because it was difficult to define. Britishness now is defined in terms of fundamental British values. This has recently risen to prominence, and the term was first used and defined in the counter-terrorism strategy PREVENT in 2011. It has made its way into the Teachers' Standards 2012, into the Ofsted Inspection Framework and into curriculum guidance. In fact, the Teachers' Standards state that teachers should not undermine fundamental British values, including those of democracy, the rule of law and individual liberty. They should promote mutual respect and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs, and this particular area of fundamental British values now forms the basis of my current research. I'm looking at whether it is perceived to be an inclusive term, and two of my colleagues who I'm working with are here today. Before I move on, I just wanted to ask if anyone here knows how many people in the UK would describe themselves as belonging to a minority ethnic group. Do we know, and does anyone know the percentage? I'm sure there's people who do. Okay, no one wants to say though. Fine. Let's move on. That's what you're trying to tell me. Okay, we know from the census in 2011 that the majority of the UK population, that's 87%, described themselves as belonging to the white ethnic group. The remaining 13% belonged to a minority ethnic group. Just as I've asked you this question here, I often ask that question to lecture theatres of student teachers. And do you know, it's never ceased to amaze me that I get responses to that question ranging from 40% to 70%. And I always wonder why that is, and I do wonder which papers they read to get that perspective. Just as the general population is becoming more diverse, so is our pupil population. A third of primary age children and a quarter of secondary age pupils come from an ethnic minority background. In addition, our classrooms are also becoming linguistically diverse, with 18.7% of primary pupils and 14.3% of secondary pupils who have a first language other than English. Yet the diversity of our teaching workforce actually lags behind. And I'm not going to ask you the question because you're not responding to my questions, but if I was to ask you what's the percentage of teachers who come from a black minority ethnic background, I know one person in the audience who would know the answer to that question. In 2013, 88% of teachers were white and 7% were from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And I know that doesn't add up to 100, but there were people who refused or people who didn't complete the census for that. So the teacher workforce is not as diverse as the pupil population or the general population. And in higher education, 1 in 13 professors are from black or minority ethnic backgrounds. And a UCU report in 2013 showed that white candidates were 3 times more likely to secure a professorial role than a black or minority ethnic candidate. And to examine this lack of diversity within the workforce, in schools and in the academy, by way of explanation, I want to draw on Nirmal Purwa's notion of the space invader. Purwa examines the place of racialised minorities and women within organisations. She refers to these groups as not being the somatic norm within particular organisations, and she refers to them as space invaders, as those who are insider-outsiders who exist at differentiated levels of inclusion. The academic Sarah Ahmed expands the idea by suggesting that spaces acquire the skin of the bodies that inhabit them. The effect of this is an institutionalisation of a certain likeness, which makes non-white bodies feel uncomfortable, exposed, visible, different when they take up this space. Ahmed asserts that an institutional ego ideal emerges, and perhaps in teaching we could say that that is of a white middle-class female. And it's interesting to note that in the Rampton report in 1981, which was entitled West Indian Children in Our Schools, in the Scarman report in 1982, which reported on the London and Liverpool riots, in the Swan report in 1985 entitled Education for All, and in the Macpherson report in 1999, that each one of those mentions education, specifically the role of education to better prepare all pupils to live in a multicultural society and the need for teachers to facilitate this and to be educated to do so. Time prevents me from actually delineating all the legislation and the numerous guidelines that have been published with respect to initial teacher education and preparing teachers for a multicultural society, but there have been many since the 1960s. We can, however, ascertain how well institutions such as Edge Hill and others prepare teachers to teach in a multicultural society. New entrants to the profession have to fill in the newly qualified teacher survey. In fact, that's happening now as I speak, or has already happened. And there are 2 questions on that survey that relate to ethnic and linguistic diversity. I've followed the rise in the positive responses over the years, particularly so when I was Deputy Director of Multiverse. It was one of our, if you like, performance targets, wasn't it, Sally? That there would be a rise in those 2 questions over time. But I also know from following that survey since 2003 that these 2 questions are the lowest rated of all. And if we have a look at the first of those questions, which is how good is your training in preparing you to teach pupils from minority ethnic backgrounds, we see that 64% of new teachers felt well or very well prepared, but a third did not. And this is just data for primary teachers. If we look at the second of those questions, again, how good was your training to prepare you to teach pupils with English as an additional language? Again, 58% felt equally well prepared to teach pupils for whom English is an additional language, but a third did not. Now, it's even more worrying, and those of you who are teacher educators in the audience will know that it's even more worrying when we note that this survey has a very low response rate. So we still have teachers feeling unprepared to teach in our diverse classrooms 30 years after the Swan Report. In fact, since the election of the coalition government, there has been a systematic erasure of references to race and ethnicity in the teacher standards, and the phrase pupils who have English as an additional language has become the proxy term for race, which of course is wholly inaccurate, since not all pupils who have a first language other than English belong to black or minority ethnic groups. Now on the NQT survey, we have a question that asks, how good was your training to prepare you to teach pupils of all ethnicities? My guess is that in order to improve the level of response, they've brought in this question, but others may say that maybe in a further attempt to wipe race off the ITE agenda, the new question in 2014 ignores the rationale for the inclusion of the term minority ethnic in the first place, namely that race still has an impact in intersection with poverty on educational outcomes. What then is the purpose of asking about the preparedness of pupils, about the preparedness of teaching pupils from all ethnicities? The academic Henry Giraud would explain that neoliberal racism operates via the marketplace ideology which omits to or ignores social issues within public discourse. So race is considered a private and individual concern. Yet, in the light of the erasure of race from teacher education, my research shows that student teachers, teacher educators, and children need and want to learn more about race, ethnicity, and racism. With my interest in this area, and however sad it is to follow the NQT survey year on year, I wanted to find out what student teachers' perceptions were with reference to those two questions. So about 5 years ago, I interviewed a group of postgraduate student teachers who were training to be secondary teachers. And just by way of an aside, as I was standing outside a lecture theatre not dissimilar from this one, and trying to gather more participants for my research, I started to explain what I was doing to a male student. And as I got to my explanation, he said, "Can I stop you right there?" "I'm really not interested in that," he said, putting his hand in my face and walking away. So that was quite interesting experience for me. So these students that I interviewed had just completed their first placement in school in December. The qualitative interview data was analysed using grounded theory, and what emerged were 4 typologies. The first of these I've named the naive. These were students who were very well intentioned but really not clued up on issues of race, culture or ethnicity, nor were they able to use appropriate language. They felt that they didn't know much because of, as one of them said, lack of exposure to black or minority ethnic people. And as one of them said, referring to BME pupils, pupils from other cultures, and another one used the term coloured to refer to black and minority ethnic pupils. Now, the names that I'm going to use are pseudonyms, they're not real names. Shelley said, "It would be good to have a checklist of different cultures." She also said, "If you have one minority child, they're not noticeable, they're invisible. But if you have more of them, you can't help but respond to their needs." Sebastian said, if he had pupils with English as an additional language, he would talk quietly and slowly to them. Sebastian also had a colourblind approach to race and ethnicity. He said, "Personally, it doesn't matter where someone comes from, what colour they are. It's not a big issue for me, so I don't worry about it too much. If you want to read more about my findings, this paper has been written up. The second group I called the rabbits, and I'll explain why I've called them that in a moment. These students were aware of race, culture and ethnicity, but seemed shocked, and literally shocked like that in the interviews, by racist incidents involving either pupils or support staff that they'd found in the school environment. They really didn't feel empowered to do a lot and received conflicting advice from the teacher professionals around them. They appeared unsure of what to do and whether an incident was racist or not. They debated whether it was the level of malice or ill intent that defined a racist incident. Hence the label rabbits, due to their startled expressions and indecisions about these incidents. They appeared like rabbits in the headlights. Their shock was based on the assumption, as one of them said to me, that everyone is neutral, perhaps meaning that all people are liberals and we just don't do that sort of thing. Stuart noted people in other areas, and he meant outside London, are not used to black people. There's a nostalgic racism. They say, why can't I say that anymore? And he said that to me after recounting an incident in the staff room where a teaching assistant said, we're having a chinky tonight, and if I want to say chinky, I'll say chinky. And he was quite shocked by that in a school environment. Stella epitomises the don't know, I know, but I don't know kind of dilemma. She said she hates people who say things that are particularly nasty about certain cultural groups, but then she said in the next breath, I'm sending out mixed messages here because I don't like political correctness. We then have the next group, the getting there with guilt, as I called them. These students could identify racist practices in schools, which one thought was due to the lack of experience of the staff in the school. Let me tell you about Shirley. Shirley's experience of being a form tutor on grade review day. The pupils had all received their midterm marks, and there was only one black boy in this predominantly white school in southern England. And he said, Miss, I've got a C for maths. I've done better than that. The teacher said I've done better than that. I've been getting better grades. Shirley queried the grade with the head of year at break time. Now, Shirley was a mature student, and she said to the head of year, are they playing safe with him? Has he got a C because he's black? And in her interview, she says, he couldn't get an A or a D grade. He could have been a C, she said, but he was told otherwise. The head of year said, just tell him to try a bit harder. So she did just that after break. The lad went away a little bit dejected and went back to his seat. At the end of the lesson, Shirley was clearing up and she noticed this screwed up piece of paper on the floor. And as she unravelled it, she noticed it was the grade sheet of the black boy in her class. And I don't have this recording anymore, but I distinctly remember when I was listening to the recording and transcribing this particular interview, she gets very quiet. And she said, well, that's what he thought of the system. It kept him average. Another student teacher, Stephen, described how two new boys, and as he said, who came from an African country who didn't speak very good English, were placed in his lower set Year 10 English group. He said he felt guilty, he said in his interview, and I said, well, why do you feel guilty? Why do you feel guilty about this? He said he felt guilty because these two boys were with a very new teacher. He didn't know if he had the skills to support them. And then he went on to say, and here they are in this class with poor language role models and with poor behaviour role models. That's why I feel guilty. He was aware of how setting those black pupils who had English as an additional language in a lower group would simply set them up to fail or underachieve, so perpetuating a negative stereotype. Yet he felt powerless to do anything about that as a student teacher. Both Shirley and Stephen individually described how they'd put this good practice into their end of placement portfolios. They also felt very saddened that their mentors didn't actually acknowledge or recognise the work that they'd done. In that fourth group that I've called Getting There But Frustrated, the students were very aware of issues related to racism, and they felt that they'd gained that through their own experience, through exposure, and some of them said through my own personal and political conviction. Yet they still felt powerless in school situations. For example, Shauna said she wanted to take her pupils, and she was an RE specialist, to the mosque, and she was in a middle-class suburban school. But she wanted to do that because she was aware and had been told by the head of department that the children had racist attitudes. When she broached the subject of the visit to the mosque, she was told it wouldn't go down well with the pupils or parents, so she didn't organise the trip. Samuel said to me in his interview, "As a white male, I know I'll get a job offer and progress further in teaching than my black male colleague on this course." He also disdainfully said of teacher education that it was institutionally racist. And Sean was an interesting interviewee. He talked a lot about his own political convictions, and he said to me, "Yeah, they'll listen to you in the lecture theatre, Vinnie, but then when they go down to the canteen, they'll actually say what they really think." He said people hide behind their PC shield, signifying that they said one thing in public but acted differently in private. Now, following this research, I was very keen to find out about teacher educators' perceptions, and I wanted to know if we could develop a lasting and better understanding of race equality during the process of teacher education. So I undertook research with teacher educator colleagues. The perspective of the teacher educators showed some similarities to those of the students. Their responses ranged from denial to irrelevance of the topic in terms of race equality. It wasn't relevant to their teaching or their module, to really how teacher educators are nice people. Now, I'm not questioning that we're not nice people, but we do have a duty to develop criticality and shape our students' understanding of how hegemony underpins the structural inequalities in schools and society, and niceness alone won't achieve that. In talking about that first NQT survey question, one of my colleagues said, teacher education colleagues said, "Well, I suppose my question is, why is it distinctive to be black? Is it a recognition that black boys tend to be an underachieving group? But I think defining an underachieving group in terms of the colour of their skin is not terribly helpful. I'm not sure I understand. The colour of their skin isn't important. They're an individual, not a colour." That tutor thinks that in adopting a colourblind position and seeing the child as an individual is preferable. The tutor doesn't think it's helpful engaging with the child's ethnicity because this may lead to stereotypes. This seems on the surface to be laudable, but there's little understanding about the historical links between the stereotypes that prevail about black and minority ethnic groups, the links with the embedded notions of deficit, and how underachievement has followed as a result for some black and minority ethnic pupils. In fact, the history of other deficit underachievement have been strongly evident, for example, in the Rampton Report in 1981 and in the Swan Report in 1985, and even before that throughout history. In that extract, we get the contradictory notion of invisibility and hypervisibility. They're clearly evident. The tutor is unaware of how some stereotypes operate to promote what Dave Gilbourne calls the model minorities, and thereby promoting success for some over others. Simply treating the child as an individual whose ethnicity can be overlooked doesn't support the child, or address nor dismantle the hegemonic structures which have led to inequalities in education. In another tutor's interview, in a discussion about a scenario of a lone black minority ethnic pupil in a predominantly white school, and how some student teachers failed to know much about some children's backgrounds. And the scenario that I put forward in the interview was actually based on a visit I made to a school, and I asked the student teacher about this particular young boy in a year 1 class, and I said to her, so what's his cultural heritage and what language does he speak? And to those questions she said, I don't know his cultural heritage and I think he speaks Indian at home. So in the interview, the tutor says, it's a difficult one. What you want, in a way, your goal is actually to make them invisible. And I say, in what way? What do you mean by that? Because we have got 30 children in the class, and let's say we've got all different ethnic origins and different needs and one thing or another, but we don't need to, because if everybody is well integrated and everybody is well supported and so nobody stands out as being in need of anything specific, that's surely what you are actually aiming towards, to have a group where where somebody doesn't stand out like a sore thumb. We're not catering for those persons' needs, and it sort of peters out. That theme of invisibility of black minority ethnic children was prevalent amongst other tutors' narratives as well. Whilst it's not evident in this particular extract, in other parts of this tutor's transcript, it's clear he operated the notion of normal, which clearly encompassed being white, middle-class, male, and able-bodied. It's interesting to note that ethnic and linguistic markers are codified as needs or deficits and simultaneously set diametrically opposed to the need to make the child invisible and having their needs met. Yet to recognise need, one has to identify the need, and in doing so, thereby have noticed need, specified here as language or ethnicity, in order later to render it invisible at your convenience. This illustrates how power operates to define ethnicity as a deficit and to erase it in order to make the child invisible. Yet in another tutor's interview, she readily admitted that if she saw a group of black young men coming towards her, she'd cross to the other side of the street. The neoliberal hegemonic constructs of contradictions, such as invisibility and hypervisibility, sit untroubled side by side in the narratives of some teacher educators. One of the abiding features of education in this neoliberal age has been the erasure of race from the education agenda and the promotion of the notion of the individual. Yet, as I said earlier, the damaging effects of erasing ethnicity denies the child part of their identity and engenders feelings of not belonging. Worse still is the association of ethnicity with deficit or need. Indeed, the need may only be to recognise me for who I am and what I have. The student teacher's understanding of how race and ethnicity affect pupils' learning and achievement largely goes unchallenged during their teacher education. They're left with their everyday understandings. The tutors are not agents of change, but actually serve or perpetuate the dominant discourse of inaction. Now, the ethnicity of teacher educators is not known because most of that information is held within individual institutions, but I could hazard a guess that they're predominantly white and most of them have been teachers or senior teachers. They've been successful in their careers, and having achieved success, they may feel that they're in a powerful position where they're expected to know everything, and they don't want to perhaps signal that they don't know about a certain area because that might signal weakness. They may also think, why on earth do they need to know about race equality when they've got so far without needing to know about it? Why bother now? In my research, I found that teacher educators' inclusion of aspects of race and ethnicity was again largely dependent on their experience and the local context. But here's a challenge for you. Should we, as teacher educators, not educate from a position of understanding rather than make excuses to explain the exclusion of race and ethnicity from our teacher education curriculum? And yet, you know, the evidence from school shows there's a real need for us to educate our new teachers for a multicultural society. In January 2014, more than 1,400 children and young people contacted Childline for counselling about racist bullying in the previous year. It was up by 69% on the previous 12 months. Islamophobia was a particular issue in schools, and it was reported that young Muslims said that they were being called terrorists and bombers by their own classmates. Towards the end of 2014, I was asked to conduct a small survey, an inquiry actually instigated by the head teacher in a school they had actually noticed a rise in racist incidents. So I talked to a group of young people in the school. The sample included black minority ethnic pupils, Gypsy Roma traveller pupils, as well as white British pupils. And clearly, from what they told me, racism was evident in the school. Most of the students had heard racist comments or seen racist behaviour. One black student said, "She hears name-calling all the time, and at least 3 times a week it's directed at her. She usually hears the N-word, and it's more boys than girls who are abusive." She said she does not report it all the time. "The racist name-calling is part of my everyday life. I have no option but to put up with it," she said. One boy said to me that he gets called pikey. That's a derogatory term for people who come from a gypsy traveller background. And he is likely to experience this twice a week. Another student, you can see, was told to go back to his own country. Now, when I asked the children why were they hearing these things, why were the perpetrators saying these things, most of the time they said, well, they're not very nice people, they're nasty, they're not very kind. One student, one male from year 10, he said, "In society, people want to feel better, a social hierarchy, feel superior. Some white people feel they should feel superior. They're superior, supposedly superior due to slavery." And I found that fascinating. When I asked him a little bit more, he was also interested in this whole notion of racism and why it happened, and I found that really interesting. Some pupils voiced frustration when they told teachers about racist incidents and they found that the teachers didn't want to tackle it. The response of these children clearly shows that they want something done about it. They want support and guidance. One boy said to me he'd seen a racist incident in the playground, gone to tell the teacher, who said, "Just ignore it." Another one, who was the victim of a racist incident, went to the teacher on break duty, who said, "Go away, you're a bit better than them, just ignore it." Their calls for help went unheeded, and they really weren't impressed by those teachers. What they really, really wanted was for their teachers to deal with the racism. And in the Childline report, and also in this inquiry, the children didn't want an assembly on racism. They just groaned when I said that. They wanted more sensitive approaches, but they were clear, they were really clear. They didn't want it ignored, and surely we shouldn't fail our children in that respect. Okay, so what should we do? If we are to develop an inclusive notion of Britishness, then we have to address the following aspects in schools and I believe in teacher education. Firstly, we need a curriculum which acknowledges presence, not absence. Secondly, we need to improve teacher recruitment so that our teacher workforce reflects the diversity in our classrooms. Black and minority ethnic teacher recruitment is the key. The profession should reflect diversity evident in society and provide aspirational role models for all children. And because Black and minority ethnic people are not very well represented in positions of power or authority. But most importantly, as Professor Alistair Ross advocates, education is a formative process. The interactions between teachers and children convey meaning and serve to underscore who is teacher, who becomes a teacher, which in turn conveys messages to parents and communities. Thirdly, we should all develop a multicultural literacy and learn how to counter racism. Well, what do I mean by a multicultural literacy? I mean the confident, accurate and sensitive use of language of diversity, knowing of and knowing about the cultural and linguistic and religious diversity of our children and our students, knowing how each of these aspects singularly and collectively contributes to the child's identity and how identity is defined and built, how it is multiple, mediated and dynamic, and for us to collectively value ethnicity and language as assets and not as deficits. Let's know with confidence what racism is, particularly the overt name-calling, but also the omissions, the inactions, the silence, the colourblindness and deletions. These are equally damaging to us as a society. Another challenge, teacher education. I think teacher education should empower teachers with the confidence and competence to engage in debates about race and ethnicity and racism. We need to enable new teachers to deal with racist incidents, and we need to educate new teachers to know how to promote race equality within the curriculum and in their classrooms. Now I can hear you all thinking and exclaiming, where on earth am I going to fit that all in, Vinnie? Well, it's not so much a case of fitting it in, but how you as teacher educators are open-minded in the inclusion of presence and conscious of absence. What you say that raises student teachers' consciousness about racism and how to deal with it in schools and through the curriculum. What you do to value cultural identity and how race equality seamlessly permeates your teaching and student teachers' learning without it being so well permeated that it's invisible. In conclusion, the evidence shows that without a clear focus on race equality in schools and teacher education, we will not be able to counter some of the vicious racism experienced by pupils, nor tackle the educational inequalities that persist. Race equality work within teacher education is crucial and surely should be the role of academics teaching in universities with civic responsibilities. To teach students to recognise racism and deal with it is a complex process which actually requires desire to do so. It takes will, it takes determination, and it takes sensitive pedagogy to actually transform predispositions. But you know, it is possible, as this extract from an email sent to me attests. Emma was one of my student teachers 2 years ago. She writes, this incident happened while she was waiting for a bus at a bus stop in Hove. She writes, yesterday I came across a lady being racially abused. She didn't speak English and was terrified. I stepped in to help. The perpetrator became aggressive towards me. I challenged her, informed her that she was breaking the law. The police were called and she was arrested. I have to say a big thank you, as without your input, I may not have realised how serious the situation was and would not have had the passion and confidence to step in and challenge that behaviour. The citizenship course has given me more than subject knowledge. It has changed me as a person and given me a different perspective on life. It has strengthened my commitment to make a difference in my teaching, my everyday life, and given me the ability to challenge injustice with confidence. Please be encouraged, you're making a big difference. You know, we have to believe and we have to facilitate such transformations. At the start of this lecture, I said I would take you on a narrative journey. I continue to travel on this journey, but this part of my journey is almost at an end. Before I finally finish, there are so many people I have to say that have helped me along this journey and made this journey possible. And in fact, it would take too long to name every one of them, but I do need to mention a few, so please bear with me. Again, my thanks to Edge Hill University for the opportunity you've given me, the privilege you've bestowed on me, and the courage you have shown to appoint me, and in doing so, increasing the percentage of black and minority ethnic professors in the country. My thanks to my dear friends Barbara Thompson, Chris Gain, Mary Young, Jana Knowles, Lizzie Smart, Richard Race. I don't know where you are, Richard, but thank you. To my dear, dear friends, Jo Brown and Pam Holland, my great study buddies, thank you. I'll always be indebted to the brilliant and inspirational Professor Heidi Mercer. To my sisters, Kamlesh and Binder, thank you. Thank you for your love. But last and definitely not least, to my boys, to Tej, Kishan and Simran, thank you for putting up with your old ma. And finally, definitely finally, for all his patient support, encouragement and his unwavering belief in me throughout the good times and not so good times, to my husband Stuart, thank you.
Thank you very much. As was mentioned earlier, my name is Lynette Turner. I'm the Acting Dean of Education. It's a great honour this evening to be able to offer a vote of thanks to Vinny. It will be brief, and I think that's appropriate. I found your talk, Vinny, absolutely fascinating for all sorts of reasons that we've already shared. I think all of us have enjoyed so much the fact that this was a personal, an emotional and an intellectual journey. I would also just like to add to the thanks to everybody who is connected with Vinny's life to say also thank you so much for moulding Vinny into the intellectual that we have the pleasure to work with. One of the things I'd like to say since joining the faculty is if there is one single word we would use to describe Vinny, and I suppose it's a verb, it's challenge. I think that's really, really important to say that. She makes an enormously important contribution to the life of the work of this faculty. Thank you for such a powerful and thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed the metaphor or the working sort of phrase, the absence of presence. I think it's something that I know I will take from this talk. It'll be very much part of the way of my thinking going forward into thinking so much about teacher education and about what we want to do and offer as a faculty to our teacher trainers or trainee teachers. I don't want to say very much more. It has been a pleasure working with Vinny. I would like to open up the floor to maybe just 2 or 3 questions, which I hope Vinny will respond to. Thank you. Any questions? Tim, thank you.
One of your slides showed that every single year the trainee teachers were answering the question, how well has your training prepared you to teach pupils of black and minority ethnic origins, or whatever the question is. Every year it seemed to be getting better, but my impression is that in society generally it isn't. How do you understand that apparent getting better and better year on year?
That's a good question. And I think one of the reasons for that was the existence of Multiverse. So Multiverse, for those of you who perhaps not from a teacher education background, was a professional resource network. It was funded by the Training and Development Agency, and we put together teaching materials, research-based materials around ethnicity, race and racism, as well as other, if you like, equalities issues apart from gender. And one of my jobs as Deputy Director was actually to talk to groups of student teachers, to introduce materials and, if you like, do teacher education CPD. And I joked about it earlier looking at Sally, but one of the ways in which we were measured in terms of our success and our continuing finance from the Training and Development Agency was for that rise to occur. Now, I'm not saying it was just Multiverse, but I think it was the consciousness raising of the travelling I did all over the country, but also to Europe as well. We did have hits on the website from European countries. It did begin to put those issues on the map for teacher educators, but also trainee teachers. Sadly, the election of this government, Multiverse was closed down and the TDA was abandoned, so to speak. And that was an investment of something like £3 million in that website. And those resources are sitting there. Those resources were actually put together by teacher educators and researchers. Now, I think we might have left a legacy, and I am still going to be very sad and carry on monitoring that one question to see if it carries on rising. But it doesn't hold much store, particularly because that survey is actually not very well responded to, as I said in my talk. The response rate is very low. But that's why I wanted to talk to student teachers and teacher educators. So I think partly it was Multiverse, it was the legacy of Multiverse. And I think, of course, providers are in different parts of the country, and I'm sure there's a London effect there, or if you like, an urban effect there of providers in urban areas.
The lady at the back with the hand up.
Thank you, Vivi. First of all, what an absolute pleasure it was to listen to you this evening. So inspirational, so sincerely thank you for that. As you know, as an institution, we are significantly under the national average in terms of our teacher recruitment of black minority ethnic trainees. What do you think we can do to address that?
Wow, have you got all night? I think we need to show that teaching is an attractive profession. He's not here today, but Chris Gain, my colleague, and I did some work in Chichester looking at why people from black and minority ethnic groups didn't come into teaching. And it is a complex story, actually. One of the things is it's not attractive. It's not attractive because of its salary, for a start, to some people. There is the effect, as my sons will tell you, of the Indian effect of, I want my son to be a doctor. So, you know, the higher professions, law and medicine, there is an effect around that, and actually that came through in our research. But if you look at the research on black and minority ethnic teachers in schools, there is that fear of racism. It's there, it's evident. My colleague Anne Flintoff has written about it with respect to PE teachers and how they're received in school. It's that space invader type notion that I shared with you. How do we actually get over that? I think we have to show that it's possible. We have to provide the support, but I think we also have to educate our partnership around that as well. And that's something that I did in my previous role as head of primary education at Chichester, was to have days where mentor training was around the equalities issues and the equality agenda. Why is that important? So it doesn't have to necessarily be about race. It could be about men in early years, for example, and that's another issue for us as well in teacher education. I'm not sure I've answered your question very well, but I've had a stab at it.
Thanks, Rachel. Final question.
Yeah, it's just a point with regards to the phrase absence of presence. As somebody who lectured in social and economic history for many, many years, and in particular the whole idea of transatlantic slavery and its role both in British society and American society, I find that one of the things we should link with, if you like, the absence of presence is the absence of past. Because I think from a very fundamental point of view, the kind of education that we've received in this country over the years, historians have actually suffered from what I would describe as selective historical amnesia when it comes to a black presence in British history. And as a direct result of that, that ill-equips educators, whether they're teaching in schools or indeed lecturing in universities, to be able to place those issues clearly on the agenda. And I think from that point of view, if we work hard with regards to providing that black presence within British history and indeed American history, because I've taught over there as well, what you do is you actually inspire the youth and the pupils in schools and indeed in universities to take that forward. And I think one of the fundamental dilemmas we've all faced as educators is that it's, if you like, a form of ignorance, that they didn't really know the contribution made, as you quite rightly pointed out, with regards to Indian troops in the First World War, Second World War, etc., because it's been left off the historical agenda. And it's only by providing those positive images of the contribution made by black people to British society that we can move forward with this in terms of empowering people to actually come into universities and want to teach from ethnic minorities, because one of the big problems we've got is alienation. Black students don't feel like they belong in many respects because the system agitates against them in many respects.
Thank you for that. That's really absolutely spot on. One of the things, that quote from Emma at the end that I did was to bring in a specialism at Chichester, a citizenship specialism, and throughout that specialism we look at exactly those issues. We actually educate to look at why, what are the reasons why there is this presence of absence? Why has it happened? What's the historical legacy? And what do we mean by equality of opportunity? And one of the modules I taught on was a race and ethnicity module on that particular course. And we often I used active methods of teaching, like role play, for the students to understand what it is to be, if you like, the space invader or the other. And those active teaching methods, well, you know, Emma was inspired to take that lady on at the bus stop, but those sorts of transformations can happen with that kind of pedagogy, and that's what we need to bring in.
I'm sure there might be further questions, but perhaps Vinny will be kind enough to answer any specific questions afterwards. Vinny, I would just like to thank you very much for your fascinating talk. Thank you.